I'm going to read this quote, and I'll put it up on the screen for you too, by Henry Louis Gates Jr., whom some of you will be reading this week. Actually, I encourage all of you to read the excerpt that I posted from him, but it's only required for MLE students. Here's his quote. He said, "With very few exceptions," and this week we're going to start to look at those exceptions, and next week in particular, "poetic expression, and hence poetic image, became a stylized literate experience for the printed page and the outside reader. And because of this, black poetry, that is, the oral component of black poetry, was sacrificed on the altar of the universal to the spirit of Western art." Now, what Gates is talking about, and what subsequent poets, especially during the Black Arts movement, which we'll talk about later on in the semester, what Gates is talking about is the fact that many poets in the Harlem Renaissance ignored the oral musical traditions that were really unique to and characteristic of black expression. And so it became important for many thinkers at the time, many artists at the time, to start to explore ways to pursue a uniquely black aesthetic, an aesthetic that drew on the experiences, the unique experiences of black Americans, in order to inform a new kind of art that would be defined by that black aesthetic. Now, what I'm going to do this week is take you back in time and actually show you some of that that unique oral tradition. Okay, and so what we're going to be looking at this week is going to be a couple of essays that talk about the importance of this oral tradition. Okay, of this non-Western, non-literary tradition. One by Zora Neale Hurston, whose name I'm sure you recognize. Another by Langston Hughes, likewise, and a very important essay called "The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain." Okay, and then I'm going to take you back to the slave spirituals. I'm going to have you read some of those, and I've even put up a few recordings as well. I want you to look at what are called toasts, and these are some of the most famous ones: Signifying Monkey, Stackley, and Shine. These are also called ballads sometimes, but they are essentially rhymed narratives. And I think you'll find them both interesting and amusing, but I think you're also going to see how important these are, over 100 years old, even to contemporary black popular culture and art. I've also asked you to look at some blues lyrics and folk tales as well. Again, this comprises the vernacular tradition, not the Western literary tradition, but the vernacular tradition that some poets, if you remember that quote by Gates that I showed you, he said, "with few exceptions." Well, some of those people, some of those exceptions were people like Langston Hughes and Sterling Brown, and they tried very hard to craft a black poetic aesthetic that drew on these vernacular forms rather than these sort of white Western forms. And so next week we're going to start to look at the vernacular tradition in black literature. Okay, so again, we started with the Harlem Renaissance, and now we're actually going to go back in time. But the reason why we're doing that is that's also what many artists did. In order to move forward with their literary traditions, they actually believed that they needed to move back and look at these sort of earlier forms that up until this point had not gotten a lot of recognition. Now, people like Hughes and Sterling Brown were not the first to borrow from the vernacular tradition. There were a lot of what were called dialect poets. Frankly, most of them were not that good, with a few exceptions, most notably Paul Laurence Dunbar, whom I think we're going to read a little bit later in the semester. But by and large, during the Harlem Renaissance, what you saw was the kind of poetry we've been reading so far, which could easily be mistaken for Western poetry, Western European tradition, if it were not for the sort of racial allusions in some of the poetry.